So I've been asked to do a talk on schizoid personality disorder. I've touched on this briefly in early videos, but I've never devoted a whole lecture to the topic. Before launching into this, I want to say a word about a very important book. Gosh, it must have been published 25 years ago by Antony Store. And the book is called Solitude. Store is an interesting British psychoanalyst. He originally trained as a Jungian. He then had a Freudian analysis, I believe, with Charles Rycroft. So he's an interesting voice, somewhere in between, or not committed really either to the Freudian or the Jungian perspective, kind of an independent psychodynamic thinker, Antony Store. And in this book, Solitude, he was really being critical of the heavy emphasis that post-Freudian psychoanalysis was placing on relatedness, object relations theory, interpersonal psychoanalysis, relational psychoanalysis, intersubjectivity theory. He was wanting to remind us that there are solitary people who prefer lives of solitude. He mentions Sir Isaac Newton, Ludwig van Beethoven, a series of other creative contributors to human culture who led very solitary lives. So, in writing about schizoid personality, I don't want to imply that people who choose solitude are necessarily manifesting schizoid psychopathology. I think that there are healthy solitaries. From a psychoanalytic point of view, Søren Kierkegaard has often been criticized because he broke off his engagement with Regina Olsen on the claim that that he was cut out for the religious life, not for the life of marriage and family. He himself seems to have come to doubt his choice, because he does write in his notebooks, "If I had really loved Regina, I would have stayed with her." But setting that aside, Kierkegaard chose to be a religious. Many people have chosen the life of the nun, the priest, the monk. They've chosen to live solitary lives, although many of such people would say they were not really leading solitary lives. They were very active members of a religious community. The choice to reject conventional marriage and family life is not necessarily to live a solitary life. Many religious lead very active lives in community. Anyway, I wanted to cite Antony Store to try to correct, as he did, for the relational bias in psychoanalytic thinking. Not all solitaries are, by that fact, manifesting schizoid psychopathology. Okay, when we talk about schizoid personality, we are not talking about Melanie Klein's paranoid schizoid position. For Klein, schizoid, as in paranoid schizoid, simply means splitting part-object relating. Objects are either all good or all bad. Self-images are either idealized or demonized. We're not talking about splitting here when we refer to schizoid personality. We're talking about a personality type or a character type, just as we talk about some people as hysteric and others as obsessional and others as narcissistic, so we are talking about some people as schizoid. It's a personality or a character type, and following Otto Kernberg and Nancy McWilliams, who follows Kernberg, we want to diagnose not from the surface, but in terms of the underlying personality organization, so that it is really less interesting to us whether someone is narcissistic, schizoid, or hysteric. Those differences are significant, but what is most significant is whether the schizoid is neurotic or borderline or psychotic. Three very different types of schizoid personality, three different types of obsessional personality, three different types of narcissism, depending on the underlying personality organization in which the character is found, or in which it is placed. So we're interested in the underlying personality organization. Okay, how would we describe the schizoid character? It's described slightly differently from the standpoint of different psychoanalytic paradigms or theoretical perspectives. If we were to look at it from the standpoint of John Bowlby's, Mary Ainsworth's attachment theory, we would describe the schizoid as displaying an avoidant form of attachment, or perhaps even as detached. Avoidant attachment or detached in terms of their attachment style. If we look at it from Karen Horney's perspective, we would say that instead of moving toward others or moving against others, schizoid personalities are moving away from others, away rather than toward or against others. I suppose from a Jungian point of view, we're talking about introverts rather than extroverts. An extreme form of moving away from others would be the hermit. So that would represent one kind of extreme. I remember reading about a case of a very schizoid man who was found living in a cardboard shack in a valley. He had retreated from civilization because he believed that he stank and was unfit for human company. An extreme form of schizoid, probably psychotic organization, schizoid perhaps all the way to schizophrenia. That would be an extreme. At the other end of the continuum are high-functioning people who are quite sane and quite well adapted, occupationally and socially, but they would be described as remote. They may well have acquaintances and colleagues, but probably not many friends, or if they do have friends, the friendships would be pretty superficial. And then there are all of the types that fall in between these two extremes. There is such a thing as a schizoid marriage. Two schizoid characters get together and form a marriage. And on many levels it might work very well as partners, but there's very little intimacy. There may never have been sex in this marriage, or maybe there was for a time, but it soon ended. They probably sleep in separate bedrooms. They have adapted to one another. They may show up to church together on Sunday, but their relatedness is rather dispassionate and remote and not much intimacy. From the outside, there's the white picket fence. Looks perfectly normal from an outside point of view, but if you look at it more closely, these people get along, but they maintain quite a bit of distance emotionally from one another. So the schizoid marriage. Much psychoanalytic theory finds the origins of schizoid personality in early environmental failure. For Winnicott, its origins would be in not good enough mothering. For Bion, it would find its origins in early failures of containment. For R.D. Laing, the schizoid is a person who experiences what he calls ontological insecurity. These are people who have no secure identity and really can't feel at home in the world, have a very insecure sense of self. For Heinz Kohut, these are people who have suffered from early self-object failure, failures of empathic and affect attunement that has left them with a fragmentation-prone self. Very little cohesion of the self has been achieved, and therefore they turn away from others, they turn inward. The self is too insecure to be able to tolerate any real intimacy. Perhaps Andre Green would suggest that these are people in whom the, quotes, dead mother plays a role, not the literally dead, but the emotionally dead mother, resulting in a failure to thrive, in the sense of a failure to enliven a sense of self. Jeffrey Seinfeld wrote a book on schizoid personality disorder called The Empty Core, and most of the theories I've just reviewed are all pretty much saying that these are personalities who suffer from an empty core. The core is empty due to failure of early provision by the primary caretakers. The self is left empty because what should have been provided has not been provided. The child retreats from others. He or she can't depend on others. There has been early failure on the part of the primary other. And so, in the face of this failure of provision at the beginning, the child retreats. The British Kleinian John Steiner wrote a book called Psychic Retreats. And schizoid personalities display such retreats. It's as if they put together something of a false caretaker self, while the vital core of the personality remains underdeveloped. Some of these writers describe the vital core of the self not only as underdeveloped, but as having gone underground to some kind of a bunker or a castle, a cave, a retreat. Harry Guntrip talks about the schizoid personality putting the true self into cold storage in the hopes of one day perhaps being able to revive or resurrect it if the proper conditions could be found. But in the meantime, it's underground, it's in cold storage. Guntrip was an ex-pastor, Christian pastor, and the way he writes about this certainly suggests something like a therapeutic resurrection, as Christ raised Lazarus from the dead. One has the impression, reading Guntrip, that the psychotherapist, faced with the schizoid personality, whose true self has gone into a retreat, into cold storage, the therapist is performing something of a Christ-like function in bringing the true self out of cold storage and reviving it or resurrecting it. All of that seems a little omnipotent to me. As we'll see as we go along, I have a different concept of the therapeutic task with schizoid personalities. For these kinds of, in these kinds of theoretical perspectives, therapy is seen more as provision than analysis. The problem arises from a failure of provision at the beginning, a failure of warmth and enlivening connectedness on the part of the primary caretakers, and so now the therapist has to somehow provide what was missing at the beginning. So these are therapies of provision, a kind of reparenting, rather than therapies through analysis. So this is the provision of empathy. This is the provision of what Heinz Kohut called self-object function. The providing of what Winnicott would call a good enough holding environment. what Bion would call a kind of containment, that the mothering one, the primary caretaker, had failed to provide sufficiently at the beginning. In most of the theories of the schizoid personality, and I can't really say whether this is true of Jeffrey Seinfeld, I haven't been able to reread his book, The Empty Core. I'm not sure whether he lines up entirely with this trend of thought that I've been describing. But certainly for most of these perspectives, the schizoid personality is never guilty man. He or she is tragic man. That's Kohut's distinction. Erik Erikson said that the patient before 1950 knew who he was and who he ought to be, but couldn't be it, and came for help for that reason, whereas the patient who comes post-1950 doesn't know who he is or who he ought to be. So this is the difference between guilty man and tragic man. Kohut certainly agrees with Erikson's description of the change that took place in the mid to late 20th century. Christopher Lasch would suggest that the shift from productive capitalism to consumer capitalism was a central factor in generating this shift. Herbert Marcuse wrote an essay called The Obsolescence of the Freudian Model of Man. Obsolescent not because it was wrong, it was correct, but the society had changed and it was no longer an accurate description of, we could call it postmodern man, who does not have the structured personality, structured into id, ego, superego, that Freud had described. Guilty man, id, ego, superego, conflict, conflicted, but increasingly since 1950 we see the emergence, says Marcuse, of the unstructured personality. This is Kohut's tragic man, suffering less from conflict than from deprivation, suffering not from a conflicted self, but from the absence of any kind of integrated self. So here again, it's not a matter of analyzing the guilt. Guilt is not the problem. These are people who do not suffer from guilty depression. They suffer from what Kohut distinguished as emptiness depression. The therapy becomes not so much analysis as it becomes the provision of empathy and affective attunement. Okay, turning to critique. I find value in all of this theoretical material that I've described because it provides a pretty good description of a change that has taken place to a degree. The degree of the change is greatly overstated, certainly long after 1950, and still today we are approached by many patients who are guilty men and women, and that becomes pretty obvious. They have structured selves, they have selves that are conflicted. Such patients have not disappeared. But we also see this other kind of person who has more of an unstructured self, an unintegrated self, a fragmentation-prone self. Often this fragmentation-prone lack of cohesion is covered over by a false self. And many schizoid personalities present in this way. They cover up their inner fragmentation with a false self. and their remoteness, their avoidance of intimacy is connected to this false self-defense against inner fragmentation. Certainly, that's true, but things are more complicated than that. In my experience, tragic man on deeper levels is guilty. Underneath, it's not as if the superego is absence. The fragmentation, in my opinion, is caused by a savage superego, which is split off. The fragmentation is the result of a fragmenting attack. This is not to deny the trauma of insufficient provision at the beginning, but this kind of coldness, neglect, deprivation, uncontainment at the beginning is highly frustrating. And like other animals, when you frustrate an animal, it snarls. Frustrated babies, deprived babies, poorly attended, poorly cared for babies get angry and aggressive, but they very quickly usually turn the aggression on themselves, which is the formation of the superego, since that's what a superego is. Aggression diverted away from others and back against the self. And this aggression turned on the self is fragmenting. And the fragmentation we see is a result of the operation of what Fairbairn called the internal saboteur, that Freud called the sadistic, and that Klein called the persecutory superego. So what appears on the surface may be a false self-defense underneath which is fragmentation, but that fragmentation, in my opinion, and in my clinical experience, is the result of an ongoing attack by a hostile and sadistic superego, and that certainly needs to be analyzed. Not at the beginning. At the beginning of work with this kind of patient, I work very much in a Winnicottian and a Cohoutian kind of way. I'm doing a lot of containment, offering a holding environment, providing self-object function. All of this is necessary to get an analysis underway. But at a certain point, when enough trust has been built up, and a working alliance has been established, gradually we begin to see more and more of what is underneath. The underlying fragmentation becomes evident, and also what becomes evident is the hostile, hypercritical superego that is undermining this person constantly, killing them in a certain way. Processes of self-sabotage, processes of self-attack are going on. There is an attachment to the sadistic superego. It functions as a kind of substitute caretaker. As hostile and as fragmenting as it is, it serves a defensive function, both a destructive and a defensive function. In other words, the patient is very attached to the abuser, to the abusing superego. The superego does not want to allow the therapist to take over as a caretaker. The superego wants to sabotage the treatment. The patient is very attached to the superego and reluctant to become attached to the analyst. It requires a lot of patience and subtle technique on the part of the therapist, to begin to disempower and displace the hostile superego. Schizoid patients very much fear dependency. They fight dependency on the therapist. But that is exactly what has to happen over time. They begin to internalize, as Kohut said, transmuting internalization. They begin to internalize the analyst as a warm and caring and well-meaning person who wishes them well and wants them to recover, and his or her empathy and containment is internalized, and as Melanie Klein would put it, this leads to the building up of a good internal object, a loving object, rather than simply the hating, hostile superego. And at a certain point, the patient permits himself or herself to become attached to the good enough analyst, and to work together with the analyst to dismantle the hostile superego. So what is my critique of much of the theory in this area? My critique is that these theories almost entirely leave out the important role of analyzing the ongoing self-attack, the ongoing self-sabotage, the attack by the hostile sadistic superego. This is written about hardly at all in the literature. It's a major omission. It complicates the work. In order to do this work, one may use Kohut, Winnicott, Bion, Ronald Lang at the beginning. But at a certain point, one has to become a Kleinian Freudian and deal with the self-directed aggression, deal with the hostile superego. Freudians have been dealing with the hostile superego forever, but usually in the context of more traditionally neurotic, more traditionally structured personalities. There's not a big Freudian literature on the schizoid problem. Most of the people who have written about it are coming from a post-Freudian perspective. The Kleinians, on the other hand, have gotten to the schizoid problem through their many studies of psychic retreats and the defenses of remoteness and detachment and tremendous fear of dependency and so on. So the Kleinians have gotten to the analysis of the schizoid problem, and certainly have seen the role of the persecutory superego. But many of the post-Freudians have left out this important part. I wrote a paper on Harry Guntrip himself, who wrote of his two analyses, one with Fairbairn, one with Winnicott. In his view, both failed to really solve his schizoid problem, which took the form of what he called an exhaustion illness. Perhaps today it would be called chronic fatigue syndrome. He would have a male co-worker that person would leave or be transferred, and Harry would fall into one of his exhaustion illnesses, would not be able to work, would have to go home and be looked after by his mother for a time until he recovered. Only after both Fairbairn and Winnicott were no longer on the scene was Harry able to solve the problem himself. Only Harry could analyze Harry, which is a characteristic of a certain kind of, as Herbert Rosenfeld explained, the kind of narcissist who cannot allow himself to be analyzed by another. He conducts a kind of self-analysis in the presence of another. Harry kept detailed notes on every session he had with Fairbairn and Winnicott, and after they were gone, he finally solved the problem himself. He recalled coming into the house as a boy and finding his brother Percy lying dead on his mother's lap, and he concluded that Percy had died because the cold mother was not able to keep him alive, was not able to bring him firmly into life, and Harry concluded that his own exhaustion illness, while it hadn't killed him, it was very similar in the sense it was a direct result of his mother's coldness and her inability to fully enliven him. So here is this man who spent his whole life, or much of it, in psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory, and psychoanalytic therapy, and at the end he concludes it's all mother's fault. It never seems to occur to Harry that maybe he had the fantasy that he had killed his brother Percy. When a sibling dies, it's a disaster for the surviving siblings, because siblings want to kill each other. They love each other and they want to kill each other. Juliet Mitchell wrote a book called Siblings, in which she says where there are siblings, murder is in the air. So Percy died. Never crosses Harry's mind that maybe he had the fantasy that he had killed his brother, and maybe that's why he had to be dead emotionally from time to time. His exhaustion illness. His brother was dead. He had to be dead. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Tally on law, eye for an eye. Harry, from time to time, had to be dead, like his brother. Okay, I can't prove that this diagnosis of Harry Guntrip is correct. I just think it's a highly plausible understanding of his case. The significant thing is that it never seems to have occurred to him, and that, I think, is a symptom of this kind of deprivation model thinking that I've reviewed. This is not in any way to deny the deprivation. It is only to insist that where there is deprivation, there is frustration. And where there is frustration, there is aggression. And in infancy and childhood, where there is aggression, much of it gets turned on the self, forming a sadistic, sabotaging superego, which has to be dealt with in the therapy if the problem is to be overcome and resolved, and the patient thereby helped to begin to be a self, to assert a self, and not to have to keep it in cold storage, not to have to be sabotaging and undermining it and keeping it down at the behest of a hostile superego, which needs to be disempowered. For a time I said demolished with Freud, completely eliminated with Ferenczi and Franz Alexander. my colleagues have helped me see that that's overreaching. We can never eliminate the hostile superego, but I do believe that we can make great progress in disempowering it, standing up to it, asserting ourselves in the face of it. I think it'll always be in there, nagging, looking for opportunities to put us down, but we can make great progress in emancipating ourselves from it. Okay, my wife Jean Hantman has written a very important paper on schizoid personality, analyzing a number of important films and distinguishing two main types of the schizoid personality. And I plan to interview her about this paper, and I will put a link to her paper underneath this video, and we will be elaborating on all of this further before too long. Okay.